The real thing that the cult takes from you is time, emotional energy, your relationships, and creates this moral injury that's very, very difficult to define, and that most of the time our systems of law and even journalism kind of look at you and they shrug and they say, well, I guess you got yourself into a mess. So yeah, deception, dependence, dread of leaving are Langoni's 3 points.
Hey there, I'm Stephan Kesting, and this is the Strenuous Life Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, I've got a special guest for you today. It's Matthew Remski, and Matthew is one of the co-hosts of the Conspirituality Podcast. I think the work that they're doing on that podcast is insanely important, especially in the current climate, and you'll see quickly why I think that that's the case. Matthew, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for making the time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephan. It's a pleasure.
For the people who don't know you, can you give like a 30-second or a 60-second intro to your bio, just so they know where you're coming from?
Well, I'm a cult survivor myself. I spent 6 years in 2 different groups between 1996 and 2003. And that's really been the basis of my obsessive research and journalism career following that. And, the research and journalism has also been part of my recovery arc. And that's taken me through to the present day, where I have tried to apply some of this material to what we're currently seeing in the conspirituality and QAnon landscapes.
Okay. So what cults were you a member of?
In 96, I was recruited into the high demand group run by Geshe Michael Roach. And his organization at the time, or one of them anyway, was called Asian Classics Institute.
He also ran benign.
Yeah, it sounds benign, and that's part of its appeal. He presented himself as a preserver of Tibetan texts that were being lost to Chinese occupation, and I think he actually did some legitimate good that way. But also there was a lot of deceptive things going on too in the group. He also founded something called Diamond Mountain University, and that kind of went up in flames in 2012 or so when a man named Ian Thorson, who was one of his close students, was pretty much abandoned to his mental health difficulties and left in the desert of Arizona outside of a retreat. And I think that was the first moment, actually, of my sort of anti-cult activism, because I knew something of the story, and I immediately took to the kind of ragtag blogging platform known as Elephant Journal, and I wrote a bunch of articles about what I remembered from the group. So that was kind of a big moment. And then in 2000 or so, I ended up, through a series of coincidences, but also vulnerabilities, I ended up in the Wisconsin Dells, where there's a place called Endeavor Academy. And the leader there, his name was Charles Anderson, and he taught out of a book called A Course in Miracles, which is a kind of famous New Age Bible that I would say is actually the root text of a huge swath of the New Age movement.
I think I've heard of A Course in Miracles in the context of Louise Hay. Did she write that?
She didn't write it, but she promoted it heavily, and many of her authors and friends and people that she promoted also quoted it at length. Wayne Dyer, Marianne Williamson, and then in younger generations, Gabby Bernstein and people like that. It's a channeled text purportedly coming from the voice of Jesus, channeled by Helen Schuckman, who was a New York psychiatrist, and the channeling took place in the 1970s. Her colleague, William Thetford, was a research psychologist who had actually worked, strangely enough, for the MKUltra program. So he had some kind of interest or knowledge into, mind-altering texts and techniques, and so there's some strange crossover there that not to fuel any further conspiratorial thinking. There's something there for somebody to find out at some point, but it kind of makes sense to me that, especially in the 70s and 80s. It's plausible that there would be institutional support for a series of texts and spiritual initiatives that would get otherwise progressive people to kind of gaze at themselves rather than at the world as neoliberalism took over.
Okay. There's a certain irony here in somebody who's done as much work combating conspiratorial thinking, such as you have, to now name drop the MKUltra project.
Right.
but I mean, it really did exist. No.
It existed. It existed. It was a subject of intensive study, and and that's the thing about the conspirituality landscape, is that it's not coming out of nowhere. It's an amplification, a distortion, a weaponization of difficult things that happen in the culture all the time. So that's why one has to tread really carefully around people's, beliefs and how outlandish they seem, because they're coming from somewhere. And usually there's a spark of integrity to where they're coming from.
I mean, governments have lied. There have been conspiracies. There have been plots. But it doesn't mean that every conspiracy is true and that every plot is connected and that the entire point of a government is to lie to you. Right? There's a big jump there.
There's a huge jump, but the jump is made by the attractiveness of the totalizing immersive connections that the conspiracy mindset and flow state really offers. The three principles are everything is connected, nothing is as it seems, and nothing happens by accident. And taken as a whole, these could be mantras for basically any new religious movement or, cultic organization. These could be the prayers of the modern yoga and Buddhist movement, for example. So there's a lot of reasons why there is overlap now between people who very earnestly pursue personal work and, some kind of spirituality of liberation, and the overwhelming paranoia that stands in for liberation that conspirituality offers.
There are so many places we could go with this. There are so many places I'd like to go with this. But I think before we continue, we've mentioned the word cult a few times. And some people argue that a cult, like Sam Harris, for example, that the only difference in a cult and a religion is the number of adherents, the number of people who've signed up. What do you think is a good definition for a cult?
Yeah, with all due respect to Sam Harris, he's using the term in the colloquial sense, which has always been a kind of difficulty for the discourse. Cultic theory and cultic literature, anti-cult activism has a long history going back about 40 or 50 years now, with very specific definitions for, what the writers are speaking about and what the survivors are remembering. And, I'll just suggest that if Sam Harris was going to propose that people became Christians because Jesus was a liar, because he deceived his followers about who he was or what he wanted for them, and what his values were, and if he gained his following whilst abusing his followers by doing things that were contrary to what the public-facing message was, then we could start to say that there was an overlap between the development of a religion whereby people explore their highest values and the development of a cult, which is sort of purpose-built for abuse. So the problem with how colloquial the term is and how many jokes are made about it and just how sloppy the language is that you know, it injects a lot of shame and guilt and othering into a study that could really be of social benefit, because cultic dynamics are specific, they're patterned, we can identify them, and it's also not a shameful thing to have been recruited into a cult. I mean, that took me 10 years to learn, I should say. But I do want to hope to communicate that message in everything that I do, that, hey, there's nothing wrong with this word, actually. And there's nothing wrong with having participated in these dynamics, which are not a bug of human sociology, but rather a feature of the way in which hierarchical groups can work. And so, yeah, the definitions are specific. The simplest one comes from Michael Langoni, who, your listeners can just memorize the 3 Ds: deception, dependence, dread of leaving. If a person is attracted to a group, is recruited into a group under false pretenses, it's very difficult for anybody to argue that they are freely participating, that they have retained their agency, that they are not under some kind of social or even psychological control. I just saw that I just got an assignment to review The Vow Against Seduced, and then the CBC podcast on NXIVM. And, everybody's quoting Mark Vicente in The Vow, saying, nobody joins a cult. People, join organizations that do good. They join organizations that are altruistic, and so on. But the thing is that that's been, everybody's, sort of making it out that he's a genius or something like that. But that axiom has been sort of solid within the cult literature because of this analysis of deception for decades. And it's really crucial, because if you, it brings up the issue of, are the people involved in NXIVM or in Scientology or any other group that you can name, are they freely acting adults, or are they doing something under what we would call undue influence? And that's like the crucial question, because it's very difficult to define, because we don't really have any legal mechanisms for really delineating, cultic control. Keith Raniere gets done for trafficking and assault and, tax evasion and very concrete crimes. But
who's that?
But he's Keith Raniere. Yeah, the NXIVM leader.
Right.
Sorry. Yeah.
I have not followed the NXIVM story.
Yeah.
That much. Well, Al Capone got busted for income tax fraud, not for murdering people and bootlegging and all the rest
exactly. It's actually really, really difficult from a legal perspective to define what the cult does, because it seems that we have adults who are freely making choices. The one area of law that's really interesting that people are working on is this area called undue influence, which goes back, long time in legal history, and is usually applied to circumstances in which, like, an elderly person employs, a housekeeper in their final days, and the housekeeper somehow tricks them into signing their will over, or their estate over to them, and then the family has to take the housekeeper to court, or something like that. And the principle of undue influence there is evoked to say, well, this person was not in control of their faculties. They weren't in their right mind. They didn't do this with full consent. But, when we're talking about, like, did Michael Roach recruit me to work basically full time for his group? And did he, sponge an enormous amount of emotional labor and intellectual time from me in order to further his own goals, which actually had very little to do with what he said he was presenting, which was his version of authentic Buddhism? Then that's very difficult. Like, the real thing that the cult takes from you is time, emotional energy, your relationships, and creates this moral injury that's very, very difficult to define, and that most of the time our systems of law and even journalism kind of look at you and they shrug and they say, well, I guess you got yourself into a mess. So yeah, deception, dependence, dread of leaving are Langoni's 3 points.
Can we give some examples for each of these 3 points,
Right.
maybe from both personal experiences and from looking out across the wild world of cults? I mean, I just finished up Daryl Cooper's amazing series on Martyr Made about Jonestown.
Right.
I think it's called God's Socialist.
Right.
And, nobody who went to a service with Jim Jones, where Jim Jones actually got people to rise from the wheelchair or could see how much money they owed the IRS, signed up going, hey, you know what? I want to die in a jungle in Guyana. They were like, this guy's doing real good in the world. I mean, a lot of that was fraudulent. There's your deception.
Right.
He had people going through people's trash to, look through letters to figure out how much money they owed the IRS.
Right.
But
I think a very clear and present and poignant example with all of the trigger warnings applied to it was Larry Nassar providing medical care for U.S. gymnasts? No, he was not. The pretense of his pelvic exams and his adjustments and all of the treatments that he gave to thousands of young women and girls, was that he was healing them. He was helping them with their musculature. He was healing injuries. Complete, utter bullshit. He had a very well-honed performance for what he was doing that was so convincing that the parents of the girls and women themselves could be in the room while he was digitally raping or assaulting them. And so the real question is, like, how did, because now this brings up the question, am I calling USA Gymnastics a cult? Mm-hmm. Well, in the sense that I can't remember the Russian folks' names who ran the main training camp, but in the sense that the University of Michigan, Michigan State University and USA Gymnastics and all of these administrators, authoritative figures fielded complaints and knew that something was up with this man and perpetuated or rationalized or brushed it aside or silenced the women themselves, means that his position as an abuser was protected in a way that functions very much in a very cultic manner. Not only that, but we have all of these accounts of girls and women going back to him over and over and over again because they believe that they're being served appropriately, but also at the same time, heartbreakingly, years later, disclosing that they knew something was wrong or that something wasn't sitting right, and that brings up another sort of feature of the cultic environment, which is the kind of set of relational attachments that begin to develop between an abusive leader or inner circle and then their followers. The main researcher here is Alexandra Stein, who says that the main thing that the cultic organization has to do is it has to rewire the members' attachment strategies towards the disorganized, whether they came in with, security in their families or insecurity in their families, and whether they were anxious or whether they were avoidant. It doesn't matter. What the group does is it makes the person completely dependent upon something that is actually terrifying to them, because the person who's terrifying them is positioned as somebody who's offering love and care, and who would, that's a great description of Larry Nassar. So
I suppose the other D's would be there as well. I mean, these girls were dependent,
absolutely,
on like, how else am I going to become an Olympic champion? And certainly dread of leaving. All my friends are here, and if I leave here, I'm just going to be a washed up nobody working at Walmart.
Exactly. The pressure to stay, to receive the faux treatment, to say that you are, or to show that you are committed to the pathway of excellence. Yeah, I mean, what's not great about USA Gymnastics as a cultic organization, in my analogy, is that there's too many supporting structures for the abuse that are unrelated to the aims of Larry Nassar, right? It's like with something like NXIVM or Scientology, we have a widespread inner core and network of people who know that what the organization is doing is they're driving money towards the top. But what we have with the Nassar case is we have this outer ring of supporting adults or adults who are participating really in institutional abuse because they want certain things for their children, and they're not necessarily willing to hear what the children are telling them, or they're not willing to really look into how injured the children are becoming, and so on. So yeah.
Okay. Well, why don't we've gone through kind of, I mean, if USA Gymnastics isn't a cult, it rhymes in some sense with cult. Well, let's take a straight up cult. I've alienated so many different segments of the population on my podcast. Why don't we alienate the Scientologists now? Can you talk about how the 3Ds would be exemplified in an organization such as Scientology?
Well, I mean, L. Ron Hubbard was a hypergraphic, psychotic cartoonist of a mythology that is completely implausible, and that the followers are protected from layer by layer as they are inducted through the process of clearing and testing and so on, everything that they have to go through the ritualized levels of ascension through those ranks. And the confessional strategy of the clearing of the sessions that are key to the induction process end up making the member absolutely dependent emotionally upon whoever they're confessing to, because they have left collateral in the databases of the organization. So we've got the sort of the deceptive gateway, and then the jaws of the social control locking down.
And then I imagine the dread of leaving is like, you're leaving, but at the same time you've confessed to whatever, that you're, 20 years ago it would have been, they know I'm gay, oh my God. But
right.
Who knows? They know I cheated on my taxes. They know that, I don't know.
Right. So there's compromising, secretive, internal, personal information that is like very dear to you that you've turned over in exchange for the promise of a kind of spiritual and moral purity, but actually that's not what's happened. What's happened is that somebody has their claw right into the secret part of you, which is the thing that you cannot have in the group. You cannot have a secret part of yourself anymore, and you can't really nurture your secret or unknown part in a relationship either that doesn't focus itself back energetically towards the group, which is why most of these groups also want to mess with or end or scramble up your most intimate relationships.
Right, and preferably if it's a group that allows marriage, you want to marry a member of the group. I mean, that is a standard feature.
There's that, and then even more sort of nuts and bolts than that. It's yes, the group will want to organize your intimate life, but also then just get into the bedroom as well and dictate how you are managing your intimacy. Because, and this is why so many groups use sexuality as either a form of repression or a form of disorganization, right? Like one group will say, you can't have sex at all. Another group will say, you can only have sex in a certain way, and another group will say you have to have sex with everybody or just with the leader or something like that. But the basic premise is that this tenderest part of human relationship belongs to the group. It doesn't belong to the people who could use it to nurture a secure bond in opposition to the disorganized bonds of the group.
It is amazing how often various cult leaders seem to hit upon that either the cult leader is the only one who's allowed to have sex, or he gets his choice of the field first.
Right.
And there's various people who clearly need his attention much more.
Right.
And they tend to be the youngest, most attractive people that he's attracted to. And,
right.
And the rest of you, we're still going to control you, but these people need special attention.
Right. Well, in the group that I was in with Michael Roach, speak about deception and intimate control. From the outset, it was clear that there were 3 women who were about half his age who were waiting on him hand and foot, carrying his computer everywhere, taking notes for him, making sure that he got onto his flights properly. And that got whittled down to one sort of main quote unquote spiritual partner who was then sort of presented to the group as a celibate / tantric helpmate that would that through by and that they were doing high level practices together in order to achieve liberation for everybody else's sake.
The old tantric helpmate.
Yeah, and it's there's so many layers of confusion and exploitation and cruelty there, but I think at the base of it, what it did in relation to the rest of the group was that it presented some sort of special relationship, or it elevated this relationship to a kind of specialness that made normal relationships, regular human relationships, seem unappealing or unenlightened. And so it was like they were deprived of something that might have been just part of life. I don't think there's any circumstance in which the age difference between Michael Roach and Christy McNally would have provided for a healthy power dynamic. But it could have been possible, and were it possible, but not made into this performance. Were it just a loving human, probably messy relationship, I don't think that it would have cast so much of a spell over the entire group. But I also think that it would have allowed them and everybody else to just feel a little bit more real about their lives.
Well, let's take this from sort of a in-person cult, right, where you're actually in the room with the leader, or he occasionally comes into the room, and drag this kicking and screaming into 2020, when it seemed like a lot of the cultic practices and the this crazy conflation of New Age spirituality / yoga / wellness / movement with essentially a variation of the QAnon agenda. A lot of that's happening online. Unfortunately, not all online. I mean, there's more and more in-person meetups, but most of it, at least the recruiting, is online, wouldn't you say?
All of the recruiting is online. And I think QAnon has slammed into the cult research community in a really shocking way that's, might have some serendipity to it, because I think it's going to force what's essentially a pre-digital discipline into the contemporary age very, very quickly. When you look at what happens to people who get recruited into QAnon, and how quickly indoctrination occurs, and how anxious and panicked and obsessive the member becomes with the content, and how it impacts every layer of their waking life, and how it begins to distort their relationships and, break apart their families even. To the cult researcher, that's all very familiar, but you're right. Where is it actually happening? Who's the leader? Specifically, the leader is unseen, invisible / anonymous. And it's not exactly clear how what the core ideology is. It's also not exactly clear what the end goal is. I've never seen a cultic organization have as its core principle a kind of, the fostering of apophenia, or just
what is
kind
apophenia?
of like apophenia is like a pre-schizophrenic state that is caused by the endless and fruitless search for meaningful connections between things, right? So as the QAnon devotee searches amongst the drops and collects the breadcrumbs and does their baking, they're literally never finding anything of substance. And so, but they can't stop, right? There's always a promise. There's always another prophecy, but that prophecy has to be proven. It has to come to life through the proofs, through the study, through the zeal of the followers. And so the followers are also invested in creating the content in a way that is very rare for, pre-digital cults. Cult leaders get their followers to create content for them, but usually the cult leader is, directing exactly what that is.
Dictates the content.
It dictates the content, right?
Is this what you were referring to when you called sort of I think you referred to it as the flow state of cults?
Well, the flow state of QAnon is very weird because it's unboundaried, and and at the heart of it seems to be what I think the really good researchers are calling the gamification of the content. People are, and here's where traditional cultic theory, I think, has to step back and do some revision, because, for instance, in Steve Hassan's model, the BITE model, where he describes the cultic structures of behavioral, informational, thought, and emotional control as being key to the way in which an organization will be organized, it all makes sense. It's like when I was in the cult of Michael Roach, my behaviors were strictly controlled according to the ethical precepts that I was given, but then also a kind of self-monitoring practice that meant that I could never stray from what I was supposed to be doing, even for a minute during the day. Informational control was very clear. I was only really getting my information about Buddhism, but also the world itself, from Roach and from his senior students. And then thought and emotional control was all rolled in there, along with, the affect of, this Neo-Tibetan Buddhism that I was supposed to adopt, which was basically deferential and kind of radiant / dissociative. And so all of those control mechanisms are identifiable in the activity of QAnon, but nobody's really making you do any of that stuff. Nobody visibly is making you do any of that stuff, especially the bodily / behavioral control, right? I mean, cult theory grew up in the brick and mortar world of ashrams and compounds and, churches, right? Where if there wasn't a Jim Jones temple or a People's Temple in San Francisco, there wouldn't have been a Jonestown, right? There was a physical location that people were invested in and attached to, and that became institutional in a way. And that's that's what got transplanted to the jungle for their final chapter in Disaster. But like with QAnon, there really isn't. It's not happening anywhere. It's happening kind of in the imaginary space of the United States, but it's now like it's infiltrated over 70 countries. You know, people in Europe and even Africa are producing QAnon content in their own languages, and so we're really talking about something much different than what we had in the pre-digital world. And the flow state, which is what you asked about, I'll come back around to it, is the flow state. And the flow state is really about the game participation that. And it can't be, and here's the weird thing, is that it can't be separated from the way in which the social media platforms monetize attention, right? So you know, we've never had a situation in which an amorphous, impersonal, gamified, political, but also religious, but also mythological phenomenon has spread so quickly and so fast outside of what people have to do with their bodies at any given time.
So let's say that you and I are Q devotees, and we look at the latest Q drop,
right?
And I get to thinking, and I get to quote researching, I get to quote following the breadcrumbs, all that, and I come up with a theory. I don't know. I'm going to try and invent something here, that the reason chemtrails are there, the part of the reason is to stop telescopes from taking a look at the moon, so that we can't see the secret child abduction bases on the moon. It's not the craziest theory ever, but chemtrails are to block telescopes from seeing the child abduction bases on the moon. And you come up with a theory that, I don't know, that Barack Obama is an octopus. I don't know. I couldn't think of a better one.
But is it that, are you getting at, like, what if I come up with something that contradicts your baking?
The contradiction doesn't seem to matter, but it's more like, how does one of those ideas, my excellent chemtrail idea,
right,
get traction, and your Barack Obama's an octopus, say, fall off the radar and not become part of the Q canon? Right. The sort
yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and I think it has to do with how much stick and traction the particular part of the fever dream will happen in accordance with real world events. So, you know, for instance, a subplot within some QAnon literature has been that, you know, JFK Jr. is still alive and he's going to, you know, join the ticket on October 20th as replacing Pence as the vice presidential candidate. That doesn't happen, but before it didn't happen, it was already marginalized as a view within the within the broader QAnon discourse. There was a lot of sort of core QAnon influencers who felt that the JFK junior pushers were apostates, or they were confusing people or something like that, as if that's not what their business is. But like,
confusing people the wrong way.
Yeah, confusing people the wrong way. So yeah, how QAnon decides what is orthodox to it, I would say, seems to have something to do with how much stickiness there is between any given data point and what's happening in the real world, plus how psychologically charged is it. I mean, the people who are super devoted to JFK Jr. Have to be in some way, you know, cathected on him or in love with him, or, you know, they must find him a compelling figure to draw out of memory. But how many people is that really going to be true for? But if a part of the QAnon, you know, literature emerges, or a theme emerges that makes vaccination, let's say, a central theme in you know, a future event, that's probably going to have a lot more traction, in the sense that vaccines are a contested aspect of the real world situation that is unfolding around the pandemic. And of course, the QAnon and conspirituality as discourses are going to have bunches of opinions of vaccines. But as long as the vaccine is in the news, it's going to be inflated in the imaginarium of QAnon. So there's got to be some sort of real world correlation, I think, that allows, Barack Obama is an octopus. There would, if Barack Obama was, let's say, I mean,
careful here. Careful, you don't want to create the next big.
Yes, thank you. But I guess what I was going to say was that it would have to be something that got deeply into the archetypal hatred that people express for Barack Obama, that probably has less to do with octopuses and more to do with sex or his relationship to his daughters or whatever, right? So that's my guess, is that there's 2 points: stickiness to the real world, and then how primally activating is it in terms of archetypology.
So I've had, well, you mentioned, was it October 20th that JFK Jr. comes back?
I think so. I mean, that's past now, right? So
right, but that's the point. It passed, and it never happened. And I've had Q devotees. I remember getting told to sell all my earthly possessions and buy gold, because on October 14th something gigantic was going to happen. Right. October 14th came, and it was just a shitty old It's a shitty old day in 2020. It wasn't anything special. Right. And previously, warnings about earthquakes happening on certain days, and there were no earthquakes. And it reminds me nothing so much as these end of the world cults, where it's the world is ending on December 21st, 1980. Whoops, it didn't end. Okay, we just got a new transmission here. It's actually ending 10 years from now.
Right. Well, that's actually a focus of a famous study called "When Prophecy Fails" that dates back to 1956, and Marc-André and Argentino and I forget his first name, but he's a researcher. His last name is Amarasingam, just published in Religious Dispatches a kind of report exactly on that. Like, QAnon's predictions always fail, so what does that mean going forward? We are 5 days out from the election. If Biden wins in a landslide, that will ostensibly be an incredible failure of prediction on the part of Q, or at least within the desires of their followers.
They will pivot in 10 seconds.
They will have to. They will have to. And the strategies by which they pivot are really all about the resolution, the intense need to resolve the incredible stress of cognitive dissonance. And what Festinger, who wrote along with his colleagues, When Prophecy Fails, discovered, is that it's not just that they change the channel. It's that they will have to come up with explanations that actually increase their faith, right? As in, well, it didn't happen because our faith was being tested, so that we would be assured of that the next time we were told it was going to happen, that would really be the time. So it's not that they were betrayed, but that they were tested and that they succeeded. And then they lay out a number of other sort of social mental gymnastics that the group will have to go through in order to resolve the cognitive dissonance. But I mean, I do think it's good to be aware that might be getting too far into the weeds of the completely indoctrinated, because, yes, that relatively small group is going to have to do that. I'm thinking that for our, wellness, physical culture, yoga, meditation worlds, that the more broader cognitive dissonance that's going to have to be resolved is going to be around, everything that we have said about the conspiracy of public health officials to suppress our liberties, is going to intensify as the case numbers rise and as the death count for COVID-19 increases. Now, we cover on our podcast all kinds of, medical doctors who have become alternative health influencers and medical libertarians who either deny COVID or they say it's going away, or, a famous one now is, well, we don't have a second wave. We have a case-demic, where there's this constant drumbeat that, everybody is lying to you. And the thing is that as the disease burrows its way further into, just regular life in America and possibly further into our country as well, that the rationale for denying its seriousness, criticizing the public health advice as being a covert authoritarian power grab, all of those impulses are going to increase in the same way that it's going to be, crucially necessary for the QAnon devotee to come up with a really good reason for why Trump lost and maybe got, taken out of the White House in handcuffs.
Well, I'm not the first person to point this out, but let's say that coronavirus or COVID-19 kills 1 million people in the States, right? So roughly the equivalent of 3,000 September 11th, which is a pretty gigantic number. If the average person only knows about 100 people, it still means that 2/3 of the people in the States won't know anyone closely who died. Because if 1 million people die, that's about 100 million connections. I'm probably wrong. Some network theorist out there is going, well, actually, Stephan, that's not exactly correct. But for back of the envelope math, there still will, even if this gets completely out of hand and goes past the current worst projections by a considerable margin, there will still be a lot of people who go, well, I don't know anybody who died.
Right.
I don't know anybody who died on September 11th either, but September 11th happened. And so I think there will be plenty of ammunition, especially people who are convinced that somehow this magical conspiracy of millions of scientists and virologists and epidemiologists and ER room doctors and nurses are all like getting their marching orders from the same text message from the same red telephone that rings in the middle of the night and says, okay, here's what you will say.
Right. What comes to mind is the distant abstraction of climate collapse as being, a really good analogy here, because the direct experience rate is going to be way under, 1 in 100. And, except for people who recognize when they're standing in the firestorm in California that something has happened to the climate generally. And, it's never been this bad before. Or the person who, even here in Toronto, who realizes that, my dad used to flood the backyard and we had 3 inches of ice to skate on every single December, and that never happens anymore.
I grew up in Toronto and we did that.
Right.
Not every winter, but most winters.
Most winters, yeah. Are we the same age about? I'm 48.
Yeah, I'm a little bit older than you.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, there's what does it point to? It points to we live in a globalized environment in which access to good data and a reasonable epistemology is like essential for solving basic problems, or at least addressing them, or at least recognizing that they exist. And if we don't have direct experience of climate collapse, how are we going to be motivated if we don't have direct experience of COVID deaths in our immediate family? How are we going to be motivated?
Data, people. It's called data.
Right.
NASA is not lying to you about global mean temperature. Millions of, I could see how people would think that, okay, the CDC, COVID death reporting in the States may be too political. Okay, I could see how you could believe that. What about COVID death reporting in Belgium and France and Germany and Sweden and Finland? Like, these countries are not all together in some gigantic league. But I could go down this rabbit hole for a long time. I mean, I fight. I've lost a fair number of social followers on social media because of my position on, following the science and adjusting our actions as the science evolves. And initially we didn't know much about this, and now we know more. And this isn't science lying to you. This is science evolving with a brand new pathogen. But I'd really like to take advantage of you being here and talk about what people can do to try to deal with people in their family or their close social circle who've gone down these cult-like rabbit holes, be it QAnon, be it the Hare Krishnas, be it Scientology. So what would have reached you on the inside when you were on the inside coming from the outside?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think one has to approach it with that best bit of philosophy that comes out of the Bhagavad Gita, which is you do what you can, not because you think or even know or can bet that it's going to work, but because it's the right thing and because it's natural to you. And what's natural to the loved one who finds that their partner or their family member has disappeared into indoctrination, what's natural is to feel extremely hurt and mystified and perhaps abandoned. But if that can be turned around into, oh, I miss them, I really long for them, and I know who they are, and something has changed within them, then that's a really good place to start, because there's nothing that the indoctrinated person needs less than the cold shoulder, or being argued with, or being told that they're stupid, or being told that they're delusional, or that they're in a cult, really. So on one hand, I mean, there's the problem with language coming full circle, is that, cultic frameworks are super, super helpful in understanding the impersonal structure of the dynamics at play. And then you just don't want to use the word when you're talking to the person who might be recruited, because it really is offensive. And it replicates the same power dynamic by which they were recruited. And so, if Alexander Stein is right that secure attachment is the main thing that the cultic organization strips away from the person, then that's the thing that's most important to foster. And so, a couple of simple guidelines are: do not tell the person that they are stupid. Do not tell the person that, you're worried about their sanity or about their mental health. Do not patronize them. Do not offer them anything but open arms and a welcoming heart, to give them the sense that, oh, there are real relationships outside of this fever dream that haven't actually disappeared, and that I can still avail myself of, and that I can partake in. One of the key pieces of advice that a number of the recovery specialists give is that, if a person who's recovering from cultic dynamics can have contact with, 3 different sets of people, it's really helpful. And one set of people would be others who had formerly been in the same group who had managed to leave. If you could talk to another ex-member, that would be great. And then if you could talk to somebody who used to be in a group that was similar to yours, that would be really good. But then also, if you could talk to somebody who knew you before you changed, because you didn't change altogether. The premise here is that something is left over. There's some part of the pre-cult self that can be still called out and can be, hugged and made friends with again. So, the role of the friend is to help the person inside, remember what, real secure relationships actually feel like, because that's exactly what the cult can't offer. It offers a kind of toxic mimicry of love, which is always, concealing terror.
Would you advise to engage on the actual issues or not? I mean, whether that is, no, Michael Roach is not actually the next coming of the Buddha versus he is, whether that's 225,000 people have died from corona. No, that's a lie. Only 6% of people have died. Each cult, or L. Ron Hubbard really did see that, DC-10s dropped off or DC-3s dropped off, bodies from another planet. No, that's ridiculous. That couldn't have happened. There's always the issues that get presented both as proof and as a refute.
Yeah. Right. I mean, the general distinction between the data and the feelings is really important to pay attention to. But I would think that in each personal interaction, the sussing out what was helpful is going to be really unique. I mean, when I think about, somebody who was in Michael Roach's sort of thrall right now, if I had the opportunity to talk to somebody like that. I think after small talk and feeling like it was comfortable to actually look each other in the eye, I think I would say, when I met Michael Roach, this is what I felt inside. And I think this is why I felt that. And how is that for you? And start there. Start there with connecting over what the nature of the relationship actually is and why it's of value, and whether or not there are any holes in it, any disappointments, any sense of betrayal or uncertainty. And I think that would be a really good place to start. For the person who was going to insist that, only 6% of the 220,000 people died because of COVID and everybody else had comorbidities, so screw them. It depends on the prior relationship that I had with that person, but I think my instinct would be to reflect on, it feels like what you're saying is that the people who had pre-existing conditions, that it's just tough luck for them. And maybe focus on the feeling of cruelty involved in an argument like that. Because, the data is one thing, but there's an argument that's being made with that data, and that argument carries a feeling. And I think if that feeling gets out in the open, then that might be a good thing to address. Like, how many people would really double down on saying, oh yeah, well, if the person had diabetes, then, COVID might have pushed them over the edge, but that's not such a bad thing. It would be really hard to, I think, take that logical argument into an overt and explicit articulation. And I think getting a person to try to do that might be a really interesting moment. But I think it's got to be, as I say all of this, I'm almost filled with despair, because what I'm talking about is like something very, very, very smart, very attuned, very empathetic that you would be doing one-on-one with people, when we're actually talking about a brain worm that like explodes across the internet and red pills people in a matter of days, right? En masse. And so this is where I'll just come back to, thinking about the Gita a little bit, which is you don't do it because you think you're going to win against QAnon. You do it because it's the right thing to do, and because you know how to do it, in the sense that you know how to foster good relationship, especially if you knew the person before, and you know what that felt like to just be normal people together and not have this like bullshit, jamming all of your signals.
Okay. Well, I can't think of a better place to end it than there. So I'd like to really thank you for coming on today. How can people, well, obviously they can go to conspirituality.net, which is the hub for the podcast work that you're doing, but you've also written books, and that's on your website?
Yeah, so MatthewRemski.com is my website, and Conspirituality Podcast is also on Instagram and Facebook and stuff like that. And but yeah, on my website, on the homepage, the most recent feature articles that I've written on various cultic organizations are there. My book on institutional abuse in Ashtanga yoga is there. I have bylines at thewalrus.ca and also at Gen by Medium. So that's where my journalism tends to sit. But I really appreciate your question, Stephan.
Okay. Well, I really enjoyed the conversation, Matthew. Take care, and see you on the other side.
All right. Keep safe.